the guilt by association, it was, as I said, it wasn't even one of his own students. It was just another student in the university who was offended by something he said. And again, I think the strategy is, if they can target one political leader, other political leaders will keep their heads down. Target one academic, other academics will keep their heads down.
Dear friends, today it is my honor again to welcome Reverend Stephen Sizer. It wasn't long ago when we have had a conversation on the questions of Christian nationalism, Christian Zionism, dispensationalism, and how all of this is involved with the situation in Israel today and the Middle East and the war against Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank and beyond, we can say. But today we are going to go a step further. And we are going to specifically focus on the questions of anti-Semitism, what anti-Semitism is and what anti-Semitism is not. We are living in the days when it seems that almost everything and anything can be labeled as anti-Semitism if it represents any form of criticism of the state of Israel, its leadership and its actions towards predominantly Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. I've also seen and realized that people are being labeled that they're anti-Semites simply because they are empathizing with the Palestinian people, with the suffering of the Palestinian people. So it is very important that we distinguish today what anti-Semitism is and what it is not. And I suggest, Dr. Sizer, that we start where I think we should be starting, and simply that we define, if we can, anti-Semitism. What are its origins, and how do we recognize the real manifestations and expressions of anti-Semitism and distinguish them from those that are not? Dr. Stephen Sizer, you're welcome.
If we're trying to understand the origin of the term anti-Semitism, we go to the Community Security Trust, which is a Zionist organization. They explain that the word anti-Semitism came into use in the late 19th century to describe, in their words, pseudo-scientific racial discrimination against Jews. The context was the pogroms in Russia, the prejudice toward Jewish people in Eastern Europe, for example. But they go on to say, generally today, it describes all forms of discrimination, prejudice, and hostility toward Jews throughout history. So it came into use in the 19th century, along with the word Zionism, actually, which was coined in the late 19th century as well. Anti-Semitism is simply a form of racism. It's no different from Islamophobia. Anti-Semitism is generally understood as, quote, hostility to, prejudice, or discrimination against Jewish people. It's a form of racism, and we must repudiate it unequivocally. Anthony Lerman, who's a specialist in anti-Semitism, said this. He said, in a word, classical anti-Semitism is the discrimination against, denial of, or assault upon the rights of Jews to live as equal members of whatever society they inhabit. It's prejudice toward Jews because they are Jews. That's why it's a form of racism, and we must repudiate it unequivocally.
So anti-Semitism is a form of racism and form of nationalism, which is predominantly targeting the Jewish people because they are Jews. We have an example from the years of the Second World War, Germany and the countries allied to Germany, when millions and millions of Jewish people were killed simply because they were Jews. This was one of the ugliest forms of anti-Semitism. But I think we are coming with a clear message that simply being critical towards the Israeli government, towards their attitude, not only attitude, but the way they are treating Palestinian people, especially in Gaza and the West Bank, One is not anti-Semite because one criticizes Israel for this kind of behavior and attitude, for its war crimes. Being critical of Israel simply does not mean being an anti-Semite, or expressing empathy towards the suffering of the Palestinian people cannot mean that one is anti-Semitic or anti-Semite.
It's very important that we see anti-Semitism as a form of racism toward Jews because they are Jews. Today it's been weaponized. The new anti-Semitism, that's a phrase, the new anti-Semitism is generally understood to be the synthesis or the fusion of Israel with Judaism, so that criticism of Israel as a Jewish state is increasingly being identified with anti-Semitism. Zionists will say Israel is a Jewish state, therefore if you criticize Israel, you're criticizing the Jews. We're going to unpack this clearly in our conversation, but the term anti-Semitism has been weaponized to silence criticism of Israel. It's as simple as that. Israel likes to portray itself as the democracy, the only democracy in the Middle East, with the most moral army in the world, a movement to provide a safe haven for Jewish people who've suffered persecution around the world. And therefore they see Israel as enshrining the embodiment of Jewishness or Judaism. Problem there is that when you start to treat Israel differently from other states, other nations, then you are elevating Israel to a special status, to give it immunity from criticism. That's why Zionists particularly have accused its critics of being anti-Semitic in a way to silence them or shame them into silence. Anti-Semitism is racism toward Jews because they are Jews. It's to do with caricaturing them, blaming them for ills in society and so on. But it's no different from prejudice toward blacks because they're blacks, or Muslims because they're Muslims. It's a way in which a society that, or a people group that deem themselves under threat, will express racism or prejudice or hatred toward another group that's a minority that is deemed as a threat to their existence.
It seems that until recently, most of us had a pretty good picture of what anti-Semitism was and what it wasn't. I can say it for myself. I was probably never consciously been thinking about trying to define it, but I plainly knew that anti-Semitism always happens there when people are hating the Jewish people just simply because they're Jews. But we have come now to the point when basically anything can be labeled as anti-Semitism, if it in any form represents a criticism of the current government of Israel, its prime minister, and the way it behaves towards the Palestinian people. Even if you are expressing empathy towards Palestinian people, even if you are saying it is not all right to subject Palestinian people to this kind of tortures and killings and war crimes and genocide, this is being labeled as anti-Semitism, serious cases of anti-Semitism. For example, it cannot be that when Prime Minister Netanyahu accuses from the pulpit of the United Nations practically the entire world for being anti-Semitic, this cannot be so simply because many countries, many people in the world do not agree with what Israel is doing right now. Or, for example, the US Congress threatened ICC, International Criminal Court, with sanctions over Israel arrest warrants. Basically, it has declared the ICC being an anti-Semitic entity. But this cannot be so. How did we get here?
It's been a gradual change in people's perception of Israel. From the 1940s and 50s, Israel was seen as a democracy, a place of refuge for Jewish people around the world, creating a land flowing of milk and honey. But increasingly, people began to appreciate, particularly within the Arab world that Israel was practicing a form of supremacism, of apartheid, segregation, the kind of segregation we saw in South Africa, segregation we've seen in the States. With the end of slavery, segregation became a dominant manifestation of that desire of supremacism, white supremacism. And as that has been increasingly been manifested in Israel through expelling Palestinians from their land, building exclusive Jews-only settlements in the occupied territories, holding Palestinians under military rule, having two separate healthcare systems, two separate legal systems. For example, Jews living in the occupied territory come under Israeli civil law. Palestinians living next to them come under Israeli military law. Very different legal systems depending on your nationality. It's apartheid. And as Israel has been increasingly criticized for that policy of apartheid and supremacism, which has only been achievable through the use of force and violence, and especially since October 2023, when we've seen the invasion, the genocide, the ethnic cleansing in Gaza, and increasingly now on the West Bank, people are waking up to the reality of what Israel is doing. And because of that, Israel has got to push back. And the way they've pushed back is to accuse more and more people, leaders, for example, of being anti-Semitic. So Jeremy Corbyn, for example, in the Labour Party, religious leaders, political leaders, academics who've stood out for international law, human rights, are being increasingly accused of anti-Semitism. And the way they're doing this is that they are using a definition of anti-Semitism called the IHRA working definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition. It was developed in about 10, 15 years ago as a working definition, as a work in progress, as a document that could be discussed, refined, but it was never intended to have a legal status. It was never intended that it would be used to define acts that would be deemed illegal. And in fact, the IHRA is not a definition. By definition, a definition has to be definite. And in the very first sentence of the IHRA working definition, it says anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. By adding that word may to the very first sentence of the definition, it becomes indefinite because you're having to use something else to define whether it is or is not anti-Semitism. So it's not a definition. And when they incorporate the fact that anti-Semitism can be against non-Jews, then it loses all common sense. You know, anti-Semitism is prejudice toward Jews. If it's prejudice toward blacks, it's not anti-Semitism. If it's directed toward Muslims, it's Islamophobia. It's not anti-Semitism. So the definition was never intended to be used as a legal framework, but it has been exploited by Zionists intentionally to rub out the clear lines, the legal definition lines, to make it fuzzy, to make it like you're walking into a fog. You know, when you're driving into fog, you slow down, you put your lights on, you are careful. And that's what they've done. They've rubbed out the lines. They've made the definition fuzzy so that it's more to do with feelings than objectivity. So, for example, increasingly it's being used to criticize people because Jewish people feel offended or are upset by statements being made critical of Israel. That is not anti-Semitism. It's not prejudice toward Jews. It's criticism of the policies of a state. But that's how it's being increasingly used to shut down debate, to silence criticism, and to demonize individuals deemed as a threat to the ongoing Zionist agenda.
Can we then say that anti-Semitism has been today weaponized to the point of being stripped of its intended meaning, to the point that it has become meaningless?
Very much so. And that's the worry, that by redefining anti-Semitism, diluting the definition to mean virtually anything, it is tragically exacerbating instances of anti-Semitism. When Israel demands that it be defined as the Jewish collective, meaning all Jews are citizens of Israel, Israel is synonymous with being Jewish, the actions of the state of Israel are associated with Jewish people, rightly or wrongly, and that is leading to increased acts of anti-Semitism, a prejudice toward Jews. So ironically, the dilution of the definition and Israel's actions in Gaza particularly are leading to a greater number of instances of anti-Semitism. Anthony Lerman, I quoted earlier, said this recently. He said, the decoupling of the understanding of anti-Semitism from traditional anti-Semitic tropes, which thereby made criticism of Israel in and of itself anti-Semitic, necessarily made the opposite, i.e. support for Israel, into the touchstone for expressing sympathy with Jews. It becomes synonymous. And he says this has opened the door for the phenomenon of Jewish support for far-right, anti-Islam, anti-immigrant parties keen to whitewash their pasts and sanitize their anti-Muslim prejudice by expressing support for Israel. And this is the irony that several of the Eastern European states and West European political parties that are far-right and would be deemed as racist are being nurtured and developing relationships with the government of Israel. It's a win-win for both sides. So it's ironic that Zionism is exacerbating anti-Semitism.
Let us stop here for a moment. Are you saying that the manifestations of this meaningless form or forms of anti-Semitism, which is being attached to anything and everything, is hurting not only people who are actually standing up to the war crimes and genocide and in general the attitude and behavior of Israel at this time, but that it is actually hurting the Jewish people too, including the State of Israel? Again,
Brian Klug, K-L-U-G, is another academic who's been highly critical of the IHRA working definition. He said, when anti-Semitism is everywhere, it is nowhere. When every anti-Zionist is an anti-Semite, we no longer know how to recognize the real thing. The concept of anti-Semitism loses its significance. And tragically, what we're seeing as a result of the genocide and ethnic cleansing in Gaza is that Israel is draining the word of its meaning. It's draining the word of its meaning, which can only lead tragically to a greater instances of hatred wrongly of Jews because they are the assumption is that they are associated with Israel. So ironically, Zionism is the enemy of the Jews. Zionism is not synonymous with Judaism or Jewishness. We've got to keep emphasizing that and working with our Jewish friends, our anti-Zionist friends particularly, to make it crystal clear that anti-Semitism is racism. We repudiate that, but we will not be intimidated or silenced from speaking out on human rights issues, irrespective of who is being targeted or persecuted. But in this case, Israel is is responsible for what we're seeing in Gaza and the West Bank today.
I'm sure that in your long history of activism in unmasking the evils of Zionism, you must have come across when some people, some leaders, have been wrongfully accused of anti-Semitism, when actually anti-Semitism was weaponized against them for supposedly doing something that they didn't do, and they label them as anti-Semites. Could you give us an example or two?
Jeremy Corbyn, for example, who was a left-wing Labour MP. He supported me when I was accused wrongly of anti-Semitism 10, 12 years ago. When he was elected leader of the Labour Party, suddenly anti-Semitism became a big issue within the Labour Party. Allegations of anti-Semitism were rife. It was whipped up by the Zionist lobby because he was the first political leader in Europe who had declared that it was intention to recognize the state of Palestine. Ben White is a journalist here in the UK, and he said this: the Labour Party has more than 400 MPs and peers at Westminster, in addition to 7,000 local government officials and 390,000 members. The anti-Semitism crisis has involved 6 individuals, most of whom had never held or no longer hold elected office. Jeremy Corbyn himself has repeatedly condemned anti-Semitism since becoming leader, while, according to the party General Secretary Ian Nicol, everyone reported for anti-Semitism has been suspended or excluded. And the irony is that in a government survey in 2018, it found that conservative supporters were more likely to hold racist views than Labour supporters. And suddenly, when Jeremy Corbyn was defeated and Keir Starmer was elected as leader of the Labour Party, suddenly anti-Semitism disappears. It was used to destroy a political leader, and it's no longer an issue because he's gone. I'll give you another example. A colleague of mine, David Miller, is an academic from Bristol University in England, and he was an outspoken advocate of human rights in Palestine. One student, a Jewish student, who was not even one of his students, made a complaint about a sentence he used in a lecture criticizing Israel for its policies. That led to the university suspending David Miller and in the end sacking David Miller. He went to an employment tribunal. The tribunal said he was unfairly dismissed and is entitled to compensation, but his academic career is over. The guilt by association, the smear, if you like, is sufficient to cause the university to revoke his employment. You know, it was, as I said, it wasn't even one of his own students. It was just another student in the university who was offended by something he said. And again, I think the strategy is, if they can target one political leader, other political leaders will keep their heads down. Target one academic, other academics will keep their heads down.
Why we cannot be silent about the sins and evils of manipulation when it comes to what anti-Semitism is and what it is not?
We must work out and live out and be consistent with our convictions. And if we feel that a group is being marginalized, prejudiced, targeted, demonized, we must speak out and say, this is wrong. This is not acceptable, and work peacefully but tenaciously to expose racism wherever it manifests itself, irrespective of who it is. That's why I do not distinguish between anti-Semitism and anti-racism, anti-Islamophobia or Christophobia. Christians are persecuted in many countries, China and many other countries. and we must advocate for those being persecuted, whoever they are. So anti-Semitism is a form of racism, and we must repudiate it unequivocally. But it does not justify silence when we see Israel committing genocide in Gaza, for example. It does not give Israel a pass, and if we remain silent, we are complicit. You know, I saw a poster recently. It said, if you ever wondered what you would have done during the Holocaust, you're doing it now. And if we are silent on Gaza, we would have been silent when the Holocaust took place. If we speak out now, it gives us confidence we would have spoken out then, even at the risk to our own lives.